in about 1/20th of the time, just to give you a measure of the intensity, and you can remember the reactions. That invasion was quite clearly understood in Israel and the United States. It was an attempt to prevent embarrassing diplomatic initiatives by the PLO, which were threatening U.S.-Israeli control over the West Bank. It was a war for the West Bank, as was described, frankly, in Israel. Now, there were pretexts concocted for the American audience. So there are stories about how the Galilee northern Israel was being showered with Palestinian rockets and so on. It's a total fabrication. In fact, Israel was trying very hard to elicit some Palestinian response by heavy bombing of Lebanon, but they weren't able to do it. And when they finally saw they couldn't do it, they invaded anyway. But it's believed. So even if you take, say, Jimmy Carter's book, a much denounced book on peace or apartheid, there's been a massive effort to try to discredit the book by finding a comma misplaced or some other error. But it's very striking that the one serious error in the book has never been mentioned. At least I've never seen it mentioned. The one serious error is his repetition of this fairy tale about how Israel had to defend itself from the rockets. Maybe they overdid it, disproportionate, but understandable. Well, that's the advantage of good propaganda. And it continues. The 2006 invasion, the fifth invasion so far, was very strongly supported by the U.S., relies heavily on the U.S. military, diplomatic, economic support. The bombing of Beirut, for example, or Lebanon was this time is by U.S. planes with Israeli pilots and U.S. bloc ceasefire resolutions and so on. And that continues right now. A particular example is Obama. He's pretty extreme in his support for Israeli terrorism. During the presidential campaign, if you took a look at his website, there's a lot of expressions of his undying love for Israel and so on and so forth. Nothing about the Palestinians, of course. Lebanon's mentioned maybe once, namely when he bragged about having sponsored a resolution in the Senate demanding that nothing be done to limit the Israeli assault on Lebanon until Israel was completely secure from any potential threat by Hezbollah rockets that were launched in response to the massive attack on civilian targets in Lebanon for the fifth time, very destructive. Now, of course, there was a pretext here, too. There always is a pretext for everything. The pretext for the 2006 invasion was that an actual event. Hezbollah had captured 2 Israeli soldiers on the border, and that was taken seriously, which is another interesting illustration of the force of Western propaganda. For decades, Israel has been kidnapping, killing civilians, Lebanese and Palestinians, in Lebanon, on the high seas, hijacking boats, either killing the people or that's piracy, much worse than anything Somalis do, bringing them to Israel, keeping them as imprisoning them without charge, of course, keeping some of them for decades as openly as hostages, no charges, often in secret prisons, which are reported in Israel but not here. This has been going on for decades. But 2 Israeli soldiers are captured at the border, and that justifies a U.S.-Israeli invasion, which kills maybe 1,000 people, destroys much of southern Lebanon, Beirut once again, and so on. Well, that's a comment about us and what we go along with. Well, returning to U.S. support for apartheid, it continued right through the 1980s in violation, in opposition, with all of the growing opposition, even in business circles. In 1988, the Pentagon, Colin Powell's Pentagon, incidentally, declared that the African National Congress was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. So therefore the U.S. had to maintain its growing support for the apartheid regime. I should mention in clarification that a year ago, Nelson Mandela was taken off the terrorist list in the United States. And so now he can come to the United States without a special dispensation. But in 1988, his African National Congress was one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. Well, at that time, if you look back, the apartheid regime looked absolutely unassailable. Then U.S. policy changed. The exact reasons are not known, but it happened within a year or two. And within a couple of years, the apartheid regime was gone. The South African foreign minister knew exactly what he was talking about. If the Godfather changes his mind, things change. What happened after the end of apartheid is not very beautiful, but there's no doubt that overcoming it was a real victory for peace and justice. Well, there's some lessons there, I think. Virtually without exception, Israeli policies are in fact U.S.-Israeli policies. Israel can go as far as the United States lets it, as far as the United States cooperates with it, and no farther. In fact, Israeli dependence on the United States is far beyond that of apartheid South Africa, which had other support, Britain, international industrialists, and so on. And I think what that means is that if any meaningful change is going to take place with regard to the Palestinians, it's going to have to be based on a change here. I don't see any alternative to that. Well, Israel's shift, very dramatic shift towards a pariah status, is very clear, particularly to Israelis, who actually are tending to regard it with kind of exaggerated fear, and in many ways are reacting to it pretty irrationally, even from their own point of view, harming themselves. Just to give you a couple of recent examples in the last few months, Israel went out of its way to humiliate the Turkish ambassador. Turkey's Israel's second most important ally after the United States, and its only regional ally. And what they did was really badly shooting themselves in the foot. Turkey didn't like it, but they let it go by. Second case just happened a week or two ago with our own congressional representative, William Delahunt. He was on a delegation to Israel. He wanted to go see the high officials and so on. Foreign ministry refused to see him. The reason was that the reason that they gave was that he was in a delegation with J Street. J Street is about as centrist as you can get. And insulting J Street is really cutting off a substantial basis of their support in the United States, which they depend on. But that's what they did. And the third is going on right now. It's the Dubai assassination. It's virtually universally assumed that the Mossad carried out the assassination. I mean, the more the details come out, the less convinced I am about that, frankly. I mean, it was done so unprofessionally. You know, I think I could have carried it out more professionally than that. And, intelligence agencies do make mistakes, but anyway, this is getting hard to believe. But it seems to be true. And that is really harming U.S.-Israeli relations with the European countries, Australia and others, especially the stealing of the passports, which gets countries pretty riled up. Actually, another case in point is Israel's reaction to the Goldstone report, which has been wildly exaggerated. In fact, Israel's reaction to the Goldstone report is arousing more antagonism against Israel than the report itself would have if Israel had treated it sensibly, but they're acting pretty irrationally. You can see by taking a look at the UN votes. The Goldstone report called for the UN to take action if Israel and Hamas didn't investigate. And the question of, and it might go all the way up to the International Criminal Court, And it was voted on in November, and the votes were kind of split. It was voted on again this February 26th, and it was quite a substantial change. Just in those few months, the European Union had been split in November. There was nobody voting with Israel in February, either abstaining or voting for the resolution. Britain, France, and Spain shifted and voted for the resolution. Australia, which has been a very strong supporter of Israel, voted against the resolution last November, but abstained this time, and the Australian press interprets it as a reaction to the stealing of the passports. One of them was an Australian passport. The final vote in February, the issue got, I think, 150 words in the New York Times, so if you don't know the details, it's not surprising.